As Chris noted, I did live in Pasadena a few years ago, 2018, 2019. I was at the Huntington for 9 months. It was a wonderful time, and I had a wonderful time going out birding with some members of the Pasadena Audubon Society on the Audubon grounds. So thank you very much for that. Sounds to me as though you're a very active chapter, a very active group, and I'm very much in admiration of that. So thank you. It's wonderful to be with you tonight. I'm here tonight to talk about John James Audubon, the man, and also the organization. I have a long history with both, frankly. I've been an Audubon member since the late 90s, the National, the Georgia Audubon, and now the Michigan Audubon Society. And I spent a long time working on Audubon, doing this biography. And I really can't talk about the organization without talking about Audubon, the man. And he's somebody I've spent a lot of time with and continue to do so, not just tonight, but in other events related to Audubon. And people quite often ask me, well, why did you want to study Audubon in the first place? Why do a book about John James Audubon? And I had really two reasons. One is, like you, I'm a birder, and I had the notion that maybe writing a book on Audubon, reading Audubon would make me a better birder. I'm not sure that's happened, but one can always hope. But the other side really is that I am a historian by profession. I've been a historian of social and political conflict for the most part in the Revolutionary to Civil War era. That's Audubon's era. And when I thought about doing something on Audubon, I thought, well, maybe I can get kind of a refreshing change here. Maybe something a little bit tamer. Instead of writing about social and political conflict, I can write about art and science. But I soon found out that the world of art and science is a world of conflict, and Audubon was one of the most conflicted people in it. And so to look at Audubon, I want to begin with this image. Chris, if you will change the slide. There we go. This is a very famous painting by the British artist John Syme from 1826. Audubon had it done when he went to Edinburgh in 1826 for a big exhibition of his work. When Audubon saw it, he was a little bit shocked. He said, "I looked like an enraged eagle." Well, we might look at it and see something else. The question is, what do we see in it? What's striking to us? And as you look at it, I think we see Audubon with the long hair. He's wearing a fur collar, belts across his front, and of course he has a gun. And this is how Audubon presented himself to the British people, first in Scotland, then in England, when he was there in the late 1820s. He presents himself as the American Woodsman, a man of the forest, a man of the frontier, and certainly a man of the American frontier. And I think we have to be just wonder how it was that people in Great Britain at that time saw this image and later saw this man who seems so emblematic of the United States, at least people's notions of the United States. And here's Audubon, the American Woodsman, even though he was born in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, in 1785. When he was a toddler, his father sent him to France, and he lived near Nantes on the west coast of France until 1803. At that point, his father sent him to the United States to take over the family farm near Norristown, Pennsylvania. In fact, that site is now called Audubon, Pennsylvania. Audubon, living in the United States, runs the family farm for a while. He goes to Kentucky and runs a store, first in Louisville and then in Henderson, Kentucky. In 1819, he works as a taxidermist and museum assistant in Cincinnati. In the 1820s, he goes to New Orleans and then back to Philadelphia. And finally, again in 1826, he goes to Great Britain, first to Edinburgh, and then to London. And that's where he does most of his work on the birds of America. And yet for all that international travel, for his birth in Saint-Domingue, his childhood in France, what does he call himself? He calls himself the American Woodsman. He's a man of, I think, a man of self-invention. He is a man of deception. And I say in my book, Audubon's greatest creation in many respects was himself. I want to say a brief word too about the book's subtitle, The Nature of the American Woodsman. And I mean nature in two senses. First, there's Audubon in the natural world, Audubon among birds, Audubon in the larger environment. That's where he lives, that's where he flourishes. But there's another nature, and it's Audubon's own nature as a human being. It's his human nature, it's his identity, it's his personality. And when I think about Audubon, when I write about Audubon, I see him as a man of so many identities, so many roles. Yes, he's an artist, of course, and that's how most people see him. That's how most people know him. He's best known for what he called his great work, Birds of America, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But I also see Audubon as a man of science, an ornithologist, a naturalist, an entrepreneur. He's a storyteller, he's a showman, he's a ladies' man, and yes, he is a slaveholder. And I discuss all those various roles in my book. I'll be happy to talk about any of those roles, all of them, during the audience participation part of this session tonight. But I want to begin with Audubon, the artist. And Chris, if you would turn to the next slide, that would be great. This is an image of the Birds of America, the folio, the double elephant folio edition. And it gives you an idea of the physical size, the physical scale of this work. Audubon called it his great work, and it was great. It was great in size, to be sure. Each of these volumes, and there were 4 volumes, measured 30 by 40 inches, weighed about 50 pounds, and as Audubon said, it took 2 stout arms to lift it up from the ground. What the picture doesn't show here is the great price of this work. The great cost, both at the time, in the 1820s, 1830s, it was about $1,000 if you bought all 4 volumes in sequence, which was about twice what a working man would make in a year. So it was a very, very expensive piece of work. It costs now, most recently, in about $8 to $10 to $11 million at auction. And so if you can go see the one at the Huntington, they do turn the page from time to time. And so you can see it in a glass vault. It's part of the Huntington collection. It is, I think, a remarkable piece of work, just for its size and certainly for its quality. In fact, it's by no means a stretch. By no means a stretch to say that Audubon was very, very good at what he did. And I think the proof is in the painting. And there are 2 very important parts of Audubon's decision about his work that I think are worth noting here. And Chris, if you go to the next slide, if you would, please. His depictions of birds are all done size of life, and I think they are in many respects full of life. This is the snowy egret, what he calls a snowy heron, and it's full size. When you see the image, that's the size of the bird. And people at the time said, don't do that. It's just too expensive. It'll never work. You'll never get it into one book. But Audubon did it. He insisted on it. And the images, I think, in some ways are more real than reality itself. You can look at this bird, this egret. You can see every feather, and it just stands there, and it'll stand there for as long as you can stand there. The details are frozen, and it's a much better view of this egret than you'll ever see in the field. But the birds are not completely frozen. If you go to the next image, please, Chris. Here's the white-throated sparrow moving around in the trees. Some birds are in rather peaceful poses like the egret or the sparrow here. Some are a bit more active. If you go to the next slide, please. Belted kingfisher in what I think is a mating ritual here. Or the next one. Pretty common, blue jays doing what blue jays do. To make the bird size of life, sometimes Audubon had to put them into very contorted poses. And so if you go to the next slide, next 2 slides, we can see that. Here's the flamingo. He has to get it within the frame, to get it within the picture, and there he does. Or the great blue heron, the next image. Similar kind of thing. But this is Audubon insisting that the birds be full size of life. He also shows birds in violent situations. If you show the next one. This is one of my favorites, the osprey with a rather surprised looking fish in its talons, flying the way ospreys do, aiming the fish forward. Or the next image of the golden eagle. And you can see the golden eagle's talons are right in the eye of the rabbit, the white rabbit. And the golden eagle is flying upwards in this, giving what seems to be a shriek of victory. Audubon also shows us birds that we're not going to see anymore. And the next slide, please. Carolina parakeet, now extinct. Or the next slide of the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeons, of course, used to fly through the skies, fly over the skies, and completely darken out the landscape. Audubon one time tried to figure out how many of these birds are in a particular flock. And so he looked up and he counted and he made the sky into a bit of a grid and he did some estimates and he came up with 1.1 billion and change birds in one flock flying over. You know, a billion here, a billion there, it gets to be a lot of birds. What Audubon didn't say about the passenger pigeon was the crisis facing it. And of course, he couldn't know. Audubon did talk about people shooting passenger pigeons by the dozens, by the hundreds, in fact. He talked about the changes in the environment, but he said passenger pigeons reproduce 3 or 4 times a year. They'll be fine. The population's not going to decline. Well, as Chris mentioned, Audubon died in 1851. He did not live long enough to see the last passenger pigeon die in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. But I think the point here is that nature is a beautiful place, but nature is also a violent place. And Audubon contributed to that violence. And so you might ask, people do ask, how did Audubon get his birds? Well, he shot them. He shot them, he posed them, he sketched them and painted them and then sent them off to be engraved in England. But even though we think about Audubon as an artist, he's also a hunter. And the gun was the tool of his trade. In fact, it's his most important scientific instrument. And think about it. At the time, Audubon didn't have the resources that we have now. He didn't have good binoculars. He didn't have a 400 millimeter lens on his camera. He didn't have mist nets. He didn't have a Peterson or a Sibley bird guide. What he had was what he could get and take from the sky. And Audubon was a very good shot and very proud of it. Sometimes, in fact, he would shoot hundreds of birds at a time. And that was just the way that he worked. I'll give you one example. He was down in Florida at one point shooting at terns and blasting them out of the sky. They were falling down in heaps. Audubon went over to examine the heap of birds that he had shot, the terns, and found one tern that was different, the sandwich tern, which he said was the first time the sandwich tern had ever been seen in the United States. And he found it because he shot so many. Now, I know people get uneasy with that. I do too. But again, that's the way that Audubon, that's the way he worked. And it's also the way that he portrayed himself. That's the way he had himself portrayed. That's the way he'd like to be seen. He's never seen in a painting, never in an image with a paintbrush or paints or a palette. He's always shown with a gun. And Chris, if you forward with the next couple of slides. This is the John Syme painting I started with from 1826. This is one by an American painter, Healy, from 1837. You can see I call this pensive Audubon. He's thinking, but he's also carrying his gun. The next one. This was a painting of Audubon done by his sons, Victor and John. And he's got his dog, but he's also got his gun. And finally, the last painting of Audubon done by one of his sons, John Woodhouse. He's about to head off to the upper Midwest. He's got his green coat on, but he's also got his gun. And I think the gun's an important aspect of Audubon's life. Yeah, it's a scientific instrument. It's part of the way he does his art. It's also, I think, a symbol of his masculinity. It's a symbol of his connection with the ordinary people of the United States. with the ordinary hunters. And Audubon again styles himself as the American Woodsman. That's how he wants to be seen. That's who he's trying to locate himself among. But Audubon is more than a hunter. He's more than an artist. He's also a man of science. And he's a member of the transatlantic scientific community. I call him America's first celebrity scientist. And that community could be rather contentious. And Audubon had a number of enemies in that community. But he was also very, very proud of his success as a scientist. If you go to the next slide, please. And this might be a bit hard to see, but Audubon always put after his name on his engravings, FRS, FLS, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the Linnean Society. Those were scientific organizations, honor societies of which he was a member. He was enormously proud of that. He was enormously proud of becoming a member of the American Philosophical Society, where I am tonight in Philadelphia. So he could stand with the most prominent men, and they were mostly men in the transatlantic scientific community. And I will say that a lot of his scientific writing still stands. You'll go to the next slide, please. This is Ornithological Biography, his 5-volume, 3,000-page massive work on birds. And on his exploration, he also has stories about American people in this. I think it's still a very valuable work. It's an impressive piece of work because Audubon gives us written descriptions of all the birds that he paints for the birds of America. He talks about habitat. He talks about bird behavior. He talks about their dimensions. And it is still, I think, a very, very useful book in ornithological terms. If you read it with the proverbial grain of salt, because sometimes Audubon has errors and sometimes he has outright lies. And that, I think, is another part of Audubon that I deal with in the book. Not just Audubon, the man of science, but the man sometimes of what one has to call bogus science. And there is a flawed side of Audubon that I think is important to recognize, a very flawed side. I'll give you 3 flaws that he has in his work on birds. And if you'll go to the next slide, please, Chris. This is the carbonated warbler. And I don't know if you've ever seen one. I've never seen one. I don't think Audubon saw one. It's a bird that just doesn't exist. Probably never did. But Audubon claims it. Audubon counts it in his work. Or if you go to the next slide, please. This is a collection of 10 woodpeckers that Audubon painted. They had come to him as specimens from the West. He didn't collect them himself, but he named them all. He named them for his friends and patrons, for Maria Martin, for Edward Harris, for Mr. Phillips, and even one for himself. Now, it's a bit hard to tell here, but most of these birds are, there is a 3-toed woodpecker in there. There's some downies, some hairies. Some of them are in different molts. This is not 10 distinct species, but Audubon claimed them, Audubon named them, and again, that's part of how he worked as a man of science. I think currying favor with, providing favors for some of his friends in the scientific community. Perhaps the most controversial bird Audubon ever did was the next one. Chris, if you'll do this one, called the bird of Washington. It's an eagle that he named in honor of George Washington. He claimed it as a new species, a species unique to the United States. But most people at the time, or many people at the time, and certainly now look at it as a bogus species. It's a complete fabrication. He might have been looking at an immature bald eagle. But many people, again, both at the time and now, have disputed that identification. And some at the time and now have accused Audubon not just of making a mistake, but engaging in scientific fraud. In fact, there was an article a couple of years ago in a British Journal of Ornithology about the bird of Washington, and completely taking Audubon apart, completely describing the academic, the scientific fraud that he engaged in. I think here the best anybody could say is that maybe he made a mistake. But again, there's a much bigger mistake that comes with Audubon, and it's hard to let this one go. And it's something Chris mentioned earlier and something I've talked about a good deal, both in my book and elsewhere, and that's Audubon as a slaveholder. He bought and sold human beings several times. He was not in favor of abolition. He thought that Black people, enslaved Black people, were not ready to be set free. He was not very complimentary of Black people in general. He said disparaging things about them, always trying to separate himself as a white man from Black people. Even though at one point he tried to appear to be a friend of at least one Black man, an enslaved Black man. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Chris. He writes a story in Ornithological Biography about the runaway. And it's a remarkable story, remarkable in its impudence, I think. Audubon says that he's out in the canebrake one day. He meets a Black man. The Black man has a gun. Audubon has a gun. And there they are. They're in a standoff together, the two of them. But then the story softens. That very menacing image of an armed Black man and an armed white man standing off begins to fade away. The Black man tells Audubon his story. He says that he and his wife and his children had been enslaved on a plantation. They had been sold from one plantation, but to different ones. The man sold to one plantation, his wife and children to another. And so the Black man, the enslaved man, escapes from the plantation he had been sold to. He goes and collects his wife and children, and then they go into hiding in the canebrake. And that's where Audubon finds it. Along comes Audubon. And as Audubon describes it, the enslaved man is begging him for help. Please, master, he says, help me. Help us figure out what to do. And Audubon says he decided to sleep on it. He did. And the next morning, he has an idea. And what he does, he takes the enslaved Black family back to the original plantation where they had been. The original slaveholder buys them back. The family is reunited, but they're still enslaved. And Audubon goes off, thinking that he's done a good deed, thinking that he has done a favor for this enslaved man. And I think in this case, Audubon tries to have it both ways. He tries to be sympathetic to an enslaved family in a moment of crisis, but he also doesn't challenge the institution of slavery. Is this story true? No, probably not. Almost certainly not. It's a fabrication. It's a fantasy. It's a fraud. But I've learned when I read Audubon not to take him literally, but certainly always to take him seriously. And I take very seriously Audubon's relationship with the institution of slavery. I think I've done so more frankly than most of his other biographers. Quite often people say, yes, he had slaves, he was a man of his time, and let's move on to something else. But in 2020, if you'll go to the next slide, I wrote a piece for Audubon magazine pointing out Audubon's positions on slavery and race. It was very much, I think, what one might call an inconvenient truth. And then in 2022, just this past year, the National Audubon Society began a whole study about what to do about Audubon, what to do about the name. Does this national organization still want to be associated with a man who was a slaveholder? Trying to think about the connection between Audubon the man and Audubon the organization. And should they keep the name? Should they make the change? And I will tell you, I worked as a historical consultant to the National Audubon Society. It was not my job, I will tell you, and I'm very happy to say it was not my job to make the decision, yes or no, about the name change. It was my job to provide historical information, biographical information about Audubon, background, and out of that, the task force on the name change and then the board itself would come to some decision. And now you know, as I know, what that decision was. The National Audubon Society decided not to change its name. But of course, many local chapters, Portland, Seattle, Chicago, Washington, and others have decided to change the name. If they haven't done so already, they're in the process of doing that. And I don't know. I don't know what Pasadena Audubon Society is going to do. But I do know that finding the right relationship between Audubon the man and Audubon the organization can be quite a challenge. And I will tell you, I've worked with Audubon a long time. I've found him to be a fascinating figure, but also a very troublesome figure. I've lived with Audubon in my life for quite a long time, and I find it still at this point hard to let him go. And so here I am tonight. And here you are tonight as well. And we have only a short time. I want to offer you the opportunity to ask some questions, make observations, but I also want to offer you very much my thanks for allowing me to be with you. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to turn it to questions you might have.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Nobles. And we do have a few questions. One question we have from the folks in the chat. You mentioned Audubon was born in Haiti.
Yeah.
Can you shed some light on the rumors or possibilities that he was at least partially a person of color, not purely white European?
Yeah, I deal with that. That's really the first chapter of the book,
Yeah.
Getting Audubon born and getting him identified. And, you know, his father was a Frenchman. His father had two mistresses at his plantation in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue. One of them was clearly Black. The other was perhaps French and European. Audubon never really talked about that. He said that his mother was Spanish, that he was born in New Orleans. He never really referred to his parentage. He said his mother was killed in the slave rebellion in Haiti, which was not true. It came after Audubon had left. And yet, many people in the 19th century located Audubon's birthplace in a variety of spots. Some said he was born in France. Some said he was born in Louisiana. Some said he was born in Pennsylvania. Nobody ever referred to his birth in Saint-Domingue in Haiti. And Audubon never corrected them. And yet there are organizations, some African-American organizations that have claimed Audubon as being of at least partly some degree of African descent. And short of DNA, I don't know. It's not my purpose to say he was or was not a mixed race person. But I think it is important to know that, or to speculate that Audubon had questions about that himself. And he wondered about that. And someone who comes from Saint-Domingue, living in the United States in the early part of the 19th century, always has to wonder about and always has to be worried about being identified as being at least part Black. And Audubon, I think, went out of his way to identify himself as a white man, to distinguish himself from Black people, and of course, to keep some of them in slavery. It's one of those questions, Audubon's identity, that keeps coming back. And there are Audubon defenders who are insistent that he was all white. Other people, I think, raise some questions, and I think the questions maybe not have answers, but they do have an important part in Audubon's own life.
And I'm going to put you on the spot here for just pure speculation. If Audubon went out of his way to present himself as a completely 100% Caucasian man, was that out of antipathy toward Blacks, toward thinking they were inferior, or was that a kind of like a cagey business decision because it might make him less tainted moving around in like the wealthy social circles he needed to get his masterwork done?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, but I think his notion of identifying himself as white, as European, was very important because, again, in the early part of the 19th century, to be even slightly of mixed race could basically be not just a socially, but politically dangerous identity. And Audubon chose for himself what was the safest and the best identity for any American, and that was to be white. And so I think that as he writes in there's a passage I quote in the book when he's in Florida and he's talking about going out in the swamps with what he says, 3 white men and 6 hands, and the hands are enslaved people. And in that passage, he talks about how he compares the black men to alligators, and talks about how the white men saved them. And he really makes this racial divide. And this is in a letter to a friend. And, I think in that episode I mentioned about the runaway, Audubon can play that role of allegedly a benign service to this enslaved family because he's white. And I think the whiteness, the identification of whiteness, is something that's very much a part of Audubon's identity, very much a part of his brand, if you will.
Mhm. Does he ever get into kind of like his rationale for the defense of slavery? I mean, some people said, found proof in the Bible that blacks were inferior. Some people used, pseudoscience and phrenology and things like that to make the argument. Did he ever go down any of those paths, or is it just an opinion that he had and really didn't try to rationalize it?
Well, he doesn't go into a great deal of explanation about his attitudes toward black people or slavery. It's in his writing, but it's not a systematic discussion of slavery. But he does engage in some of the contribute to the pseudoscience. He collects skulls from both African American and indigenous people, and Mexican people for that matter. Craniology was one of those forms of science in the 19th century that was trying to create racial hierarchies, and Audubon contributed to that. And I think that he doesn't have a coherent explanation about his attitudes on race, but most people in the 19th century didn't. And yet he felt what he felt and believed what he believed and did what he did.
Yes. We have a couple of questions about birds and Audubon. The first question is, were all the birds he painted already discovered and named by others, or did Audubon also discover and name some birds himself?
Well, I think, discover is a curious term. He certainly named some.
Okay.
And the woodpeckers I showed you, but the way things worked in the 19th century, you didn't normally you couldn't name bird species for yourself. So you name them for somebody else. And so here he names the bird of Washington for George Washington. He names the woodpeckers for his friends. He has birds that he names that are named for Thomas Nuttall, John Kirk Townsend, friends of his, William Swainson. There was a lot of kind of mutual back and forth of naming birds, rewarding friends, and currying favor with people. I think there were some birds. I mean, Audubon's testimony about the sandwich tern, which I mentioned, that nobody had ever seen one in the United States. That may be true. It may be an excessive claim, but nobody had written about sandwich terns before that. Certainly not that the other leading bird artist, Alexander Wilson. And so I think that we have to give Audubon some credit as an ornithologist. Certainly a very good birder, and nobody is a better painter of birds that I can think of. And yet I think we also have to be aware that Audubon could sometimes very much stretch the truth and even fabricate species.
Kind of a follow-up question about the names. You mentioned that he named several birds after friends. Was there also kind of a money aspect with that, of like, if I name this bird after Townsend, maybe Townsend's going to subscribe to my book?
Well, I think there was some of that, yeah. And certainly, he's naming some of the birds for prominent American and European gentlemen of science. And I think it's not just a quid pro quo that he names a bird and they buy his book, but I think it's a way he associates himself within the scientific community. Putting a little luster onto some of the birds that he identifies, rather than just give kind of a, tufted titmouse is not a very exciting name.
Right.
But if it's Spurgeon's titmouse, it might have a little more cachet.
I could not agree more.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And by the way, my next eBird checklist, I'm definitely putting down carbonated warbler.
There you go. And you might get a little pushback on that one.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah. So he goes to Europe and starts to undertake his great work. And you had mentioned that he had become members of these prestigious societies. Was he seen kind of like as an equal to other scientists and natural philosopher people of the age in Europe, or was he kind of looked down on because he was kind of this frontier rube looking guy?
Well, it depends who you talk to. As I said, the scientific community, the transatlantic scientific community, certainly in the world of birds, was sizable but not huge, and people knew each other, knew each other's work. And Audubon had two very one in Philadelphia, George Ord, and then in England, Charles Waterton. And these people could not stand Audubon. They thought Audubon was a fraud. They didn't believe any of his work. They thought the paintings were no good. And yet Audubon did have a decent amount of credibility. And it wasn't just a question of being looked down upon as the rube, because, there are the paintings. And the proof, I think, in many ways is in the painting. Nobody else had done that. Nobody else had the gall to do that, to say, I'm going to get every bird in America, every bird in North America, or at least the eastern part of North America. Alexander Wilson, one of Audubon's predecessors and rival, had tried, but Audubon made sure that he got more birds than Wilson, that his identifications were better, that his paintings were better. And I think it's fair to say that in Audubon's era, there was nobody on either side of the Atlantic who was better at depicting birds in the field. Mm-hmm. And certainly, again, depicting them size of life, full-size birds. Nobody did that.
Okay, so how about his reputation as an artist in Europe? Or was he, praised and lauded by the artistic community there?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of learned institutions, universities, libraries bought sets of the birds of America, as they did in the United States.
But for artistic reasons or scientific reasons, or both?
A little bit of both. I mean, I think when you look at the images, they are beautiful. They're wonderful, and they're not just stock profile pictures of birds. The birds are alive. They're in nature. And there's something that's really, I think, very lively, very evocative about Audubon's images of birds. And so I think they hold up as artistic expressions. And now you find them not just in scientific circles, but they're in art museums. And they're reproduced so many times. Probably half the members of your society have Audubon images of some size in their house. Yeah. We like it. It's good. Most people don't care too much, or most people don't ask too much about the science behind the paintings. The paintings seem to be enough in themselves.
Okay, I have a couple questions about the books. One, do you happen to know how many copies of Birds of America were made, and how many still exist?
There were about 200 all told, and again, he did it in a piecemeal fashion. He didn't just publish the book at once. He would do it 5 images at a time. And so if you subscribed in, say, 1827, 1828 to Audubon's Birds of America, you would get every so often in a big tin box 5 images, one of a big bird, one of a middle-sized bird, and 3 small birds. Because Audubon knew that everybody wanted the big birds, and he wasn't going to give them away all at once. And so over the course of the next few years, he actually promised more birds than he had. And so, but his notion was that if you subscribed and if you actually kept paying him money, then you would get eventually enough images, 435 plates, that you would bind into 4 volumes. And that would be a great possession for your library, for your university, or for your home. And some people bought all 4 volumes, had them bound, had special furniture built for them, because you couldn't put it on your lap.
Right.
You couldn't sit there and thumb through it. They had these big wooden tables where you look at it. There's a wonderful story. A man named, you can go to the University of Pittsburgh site, and the Darlington Library collection has Audubon's birds and the ornithological biography all digitized, so you can look at them digitally. But the man who gave that, Mr. Darlington, had a big collection of all 4 volumes. And they realized after a while that they had bourbon and cigar ash stains on them, because he would sit there with his friends looking at them and saying, "Look at that bird," and they'd drip bourbon or whatever.
No.
So finally, they had to be cleaned down in South Carolina and returned to the library. Not everybody, of course, paid off. There was a wonderful story about Daniel Webster, senator from Massachusetts. Webster subscribed to the Birds of America, but he didn't pay in a very timely fashion. And so Audubon goes to Boston, tries to track him down, tries to go to his office, tries to get him to pay what he owes, and finally cuts him off. And so Daniel Webster only had 3 volumes of Birds of America, not all 4. And so Webster's collection is in the Dartmouth College Library. And so they have 3 volumes of Birds of America, but not all 4, because Webster didn't finish paying.
That's great. I'm curious, do you own anything by Audubon? Do you have a sketch or a signature or a letter or anything?
I have, there are a number of prints of Audubon images done full size, but after the fact. I have one, and in fact, the one of the kingfishers I showed you, we have in our dining room at home.
Wow.
It was from the Amsterdam printing in the 1960s, where they've done kind of high quality prints. A few years ago, the Field Museum and the Oppenheimer Gallery in Chicago collaborated what they called Audubon's 50 Best Birds, or Greatest Hits, made in the 50s. So they took the Field Museum's copy of the Birds of America, put it in a armored car, drove it off, had it digitally photographed, certain images. And so now you can buy them. Back in the 1930s, Macy's, the department store in New York, took copies of the Birds of America, the intact volumes, and cut them up. They cut them up and sold individual images, a real Audubon, because they thought it's much more democratic. Why should these be in musty libraries seen only by musty scholars? And so they said, you too, for a price, can have a real Audubon in your house. And so, and again, the prices were higher for the big birds, smaller for, sparrows and titmice and so forth. But that led to the destruction of at least 3, if not 4, sets of the Birds of America.
Well, I continue to look through yard sales just in case I happen to see a really big book.
You might get lucky.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
I have a question here that I'm just going to read to you. It's a little bit detailed. One of our audience members tonight says that they have a copy of Delineations of American Scenery and Character with an introduction by Francis Hobart Herrick.
Yeah,
it was published in 1926.
Right.
And they say in the introduction, Herrick states that Jean-Jacques Forgeron, was Audubon's baptismal name, and his mother was a French Creole woman named Robin. Yes. And they're wondering, has that ever been disproven definitively, or is that still a possibility?
No, it's not been disproven. And There was an Audubon biographer named Alice Ford in the 1960s who wrote a big biography of Audubon.
Yeah.
And she wrote a second edition of it in 1988, I believe it was, 84, where she is very insistent that Audubon's birth mother was a French woman who came over from France to Saint-Domingue and worked in the household of Jean Audubon, the sea captain and slaveholder, and that she was Audubon's mother, and she was all French, and Audubon was therefore all European. No, nobody has ever really proven definitively that his mother was anything other than French. But there have been, again, suspicions, rumors. There's been talk, and Audubon himself was so evasive about who his mother was that I think he contributes to some of the doubt himself, or contributed in writing an autobiography called Myself, which was written for his sons. That's when he tells them that his mother was Spanish. She was very beautiful. She was wealthy. She was in New Orleans when he was born, and then went back to Saint-Domingue and was killed. Well, that's completely untrue. And I think Audubon's own duplicity, about his parentage, again, adds to some people's skepticism. And it's not, again, it's not my place to say that his mother was or was not white, that he was or was not all white. But I think thinking about the context in the 19th century, and even the context now in the 21st century, how do we see Audubon? How does he portray himself? And how do these questions of identity begin to enter into this larger narrative of him and how we understand him?
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you happen to know, are there any living descendants of Audubon?
Yes, one very unhappily went after me.
Oh,
She offered up DNA and said she can prove through her own DNA that she's white, which is fine. I'm not going to engage that because it wasn't my desire, my task to say that he was anything other than white anyway. But there are some. I had dinner one time at the Roger Torrey Peterson Center in Connecticut, and one of the people sitting there was a descendant of Audubon.
wow.
And so, yeah, there are some. There are.
Okay. Yeah. So, are you available for a few more questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. We're kind of, I think we're going to get to the kind of the elephant in the room here with some of these questions, and that has to do with how Audubon's name affects the environmental organizations that we're all involved with. First question is, do you know the history of why Audubon societies started calling themselves that, as opposed to, the Bird Protection Society or the Avian Society? Right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to point out, by the way, that Audubon had nothing to do with creating the Audubon Society.
Right, he was well dead by the time. Yeah.
Excuse me?
He was dead and gone by then.
Dead and gone. Died in 1851. There were some young women at Smith College who started an Audubon. They started an organization to try to oppose the use of feathers in women's hats, and they called themselves the Audubon Society. The founder, one of the main founders of the National Audubon Society in 1905 was George Bird Grinnell. Grinnell was an editor of Field and Stream, but he had also lived next door to the Audubons. After Audubon was dead, he studied with Lucy Audubon, Audubon's wife, knew the sons until they died. And so there was some personal connection there. And when Grinnell starts the National Audubon Society, he embraces the name Audubon as the most celebrated ornithologist, most celebrated bird artist of the 19th century. Now, there are other bird organizations. There's the Thomas Nuttall Society. There's the American Ornithological Union. But I think that Audubon was the name that had an identity and it caught on, and I think people could make that connection. If not to Audubon the man, at least to Audubon the art. And
So,
so,
yeah.
they chose it, I think, because it had uh, a kind of already created identity.
Mhm. I see. So 50 years after his death and a bit more,
Yeah.
he's still a household name at that point. He's still very well known in America.
Yeah, well known for his bird pictures.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, and what Grinnell and others knew or cared about his slaveholding, I don't know.
Right. Okay. I want to go back to speaking of slaveholding, the runaway slave story that you presented. Lois is asking, was that presented as a piece of fiction, or did he, just reading that, were you supposed to believe that was true or made up, or were you so used to, did the reader of his books catch on to like, oh, he's making stuff up left to right and center here?
Well, he wrote it, presenting it as being
Right.
true.
Okay. As
One of the
opposed to
things
say
he
like,
did-
I was thinking like, as opposed to say like Mark Twain, where you read,
no,
biographical things and that of course they're made up.
no. Audubon was serious. He
Okay.
took himself seriously.
Mhm.
Ornithological biography, by the way, has every few chapters, he gets away from birds and talks about people,
Mhm.
or the American, and that's the delineations of American scenery and character. Because he says, ornithology is boring. And after a few chapters about birds, you're going to want to read something else. And so he writes these other kinds of stories. Some of them are kind of swashbuckling tales. He writes about pirates. He writes about bandits in the woods. He writes about, earthquakes and so forth. But he also, in this one case, and only one case, writes about this encounter, this alleged encounter with this escaped enslaved man. I don't think it's true. In fact, I'm sure it's not true, but it was carried in the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper. And so they took it as being true enough or useful enough to present to an abolitionist audience, even though they left out the last part where he takes the slaves back and turns them back to the master.
Interesting.
It's there's a lot of, I think, plagiarism's an unkind term. It's just copying, repurposing of writings. And I do think, and I have no way of proving this, but I do think that there are more people who read Audubon's writings in the 19th century than ever saw his birds.
Oh, interesting.
He didn't like to exhibit them.
Okay.
They weren't very often in public places, whereas some of his episodes from ornithological biography were reprinted in the newspapers. So I think a lot of people were able to read that,
Mhm.
even though they might not be able to see the images that sometimes accompanied that.
Do you think he ended up making more money on the biographies than on the Birds of America?
Well, he made a decent amount of money, but never enough.
Mhm.
He was able to buy a pretty nice house on the Upper West Side of New York, about 155th Street, I believe.
Right.
But he never was financially secure. When he died, Lucy, his wife, eventually sold all of his watercolors to the New York Historical Society. And frankly, thank God she did,
Hmm.
because now they're preserved, now they're kept. And so all of Audubon's original watercolors, and almost all of them, are the New York Historical Society, and you can see them there. Had they been in her possession, they would have gotten, well, who knows, scattered to the winds, perhaps. But the Audubon family was always trying to make a buck.
Yeah.
And he did engage the whole family. It was a family business. I mean, he was the brains behind it. He was the artist. He was the scientist. But Lucy got involved in it. His sons, he wanted his sons to be artists, and they were good, but not good enough for him.
Mhm.
And after he died, they tried to do a smaller version, the octavo version.
Right.
they were really trying to play on the Audubon name and the Audubon images, but trying to create less expensive versions that ordinary people could perhaps
Right.
buy.
Okay. Yeah, I have to say your book has really fascinating stuff about his early life in the early years of his marriage, where he is not a rich person. He is having a real, hand to mouth,
Yeah.
struggling existence financially. It could not have been fun for him or his wife or his family.
No, he went bankrupt in 1819. Although a lot of people did, to be fair, in the panic of 1819, a lot of people lost their shirts. Audubon then wound up working at the Western Museum in Cincinnati as a taxidermist and a museum assistant. He hated it. And after a while, he had run out of things to do. So he heads off down to New Orleans. But it was, I mean, he was a good businessman in terms of selling the birds of America. In terms of running a farm for his father, in terms of running a store, he
Yeah.
was always
I know.
distracted, as I think sometimes we are, just by
Yeah.
what's going on in the sky.
Right.
You know.
I do have a couple questions coming up about National Audubon and their decision, but I want to jump back to a question I got earlier about, frankly, about his womanizing. You mentioned he was a womanizer, and he was away from his wife Lucy for months and months and months at a time. What kind of dirt do you have on him that you can tell us?
Actually, he provides a good deal of dirt himself. There's a wonderful story. He's in New Orleans in the early 1820s, and he's painting portraits, which he hates. He really despises painting portraits, but it's how you make money.
Yeah.
And this woman comes up to him, at least, and again, I have to say this is the story Audubon tells, so maybe it's true, maybe not. But this woman comes up to him on the street and says, can you do a painting of me? And he says, well, yes. She says, can you do it full size, my full figure, full body? He says, yeah. She says, can you do it in the nude? And he says, well, okay. So he does. He does his painting. So he says, no one's ever seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, she pays him, not in cash, but says, go out and buy the best gun you can find in New Orleans. And then he has engraved on, she tells him to engrave something on the barrel, which is something about a friend will always be a friend. I can't remember if it was in French. But then he engraves his own initials or name on the ramrod. And so every time the phallic symbolism that is pretty obvious.
Yeah, you don't have to be Freud to figure that out. Yeah.
No, you don't. But you have to be Lucy to hear it, because he knows the story because he writes it in a letter to his wife.
Oh my goodness.
And she's back up in Kentucky trying to mind the store and the kids. And he says, well, this great adventure he's had. When he's in England later and she's down in Louisiana teaching school, trying to send him money to keep him going, he writes about how all the women in England love him and they think he's so handsome and has got long flowing hair. And, this must be driving her crazy.
Right.
And, is there any proof of his womanizing in ways that we might recognize today? Not really. He
Mm-hmm.
likes to talk about it. I don't think he ever has to pay anybody off.
Yeah. Okay, so let me now ask you a couple National Audubon questions. So, as you mentioned, you were an advisor to the National Audubon Society as they were considering changing their name, and as I think everyone here knows, they chose not to change their name, and they have a defense and a rationale for that. Did you have? How do you feel about their decision? Do you have? I know they didn't ask you to make the decision, but do you have an opinion on it? Do you think it was the right decision or a mistake?
I told them in the beginning I could write a very compelling argument either way. I could tell you why you ought to change your name. I'll tell you why you ought not. I was surprised, frankly, when they didn't change the name.
Okay.
I thought they would. I think looking down the road, and again, I understand all the reasons for keeping it. The long-term identity, the branding.
Mhm.
There are a lot of Audubon products, a lot of Audubon travel. Um, and I think that they had a problem that local Audubon chapters don't have, and that is the larger Audubon brand. And I'd say that, really in commercial terms.
Mhm.
Um, I think that it's one of those issues that if I were to make a prediction, I'd say that eventually they will change the name because there's some erosion going on at the bottom. The local chapters, and not small ones, but I mean Chicago, Portland, Seattle, New York are changing their names. I don't know about Massachusetts, but they're not related to the National Audubon Society anyway.
Right.
There's some separate Audubon Society chapters.
I feel like I might have seen a thing that Mass Audubon has decided not to, but I can't swear to that.
Well,
I think I saw
I
that.
talked to a reporter for the Boston Globe, and the headline was Mass Audubon decides not to change name for now.
For now. Okay.
And who knows? I think that it's the kind of thing they're going to keep having to deal with because I think as more and more, one of the challenges for Audubon, of course, in the national level, and maybe even for your own chapter, is to increase the equity diversity side of things, and especially engage young people. I always think of birding as kind of an older person's sport, but a lot of young people get into it, and that's I think the future. Getting young people and children of color involved, and I think that the way people respond to the retention of the Audubon name, it might make sense from a financial and identity point of view, but some people might see it as a form of indifference, if not digging in one's institutional heels.
Mhm.
And so I think there might be people who would be unhappy to become associated with the Audubon Society because of the questions surrounding who this man was.
Right.
Questions that hadn't really come out much in the 20th century. The whole question of Audubon slaveholding, his attitude on race, was kind of hidden in plain sight. It was right there.
Yeah.
It wasn't hard to find, but I think there's a tendency to say, well, he was a man of his time. People did that. Well, there are a lot of people at that time who didn't and who spoke out against it. And Audubon very clearly chose to be on what I would say is the wrong side of the slave issue, which was the most important issue in the first half of the 19th century. And how people respond to that now and in the future, frankly, I think is going to continue to be a challenge, if not a problem, for the National Audubon Society.
Right. Of the organizations that have changed their name so far, or that have said they're going to, I've seen two alternative names. The Audubon Natural Society in Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
is changing their name to Nature Forward.
Yeah.
And the Seattle Audubon Society is changing their name to Birds Connect Seattle.
Yeah.
You're a historian. You're not a branding expert, but do you have an opinion on those names? Do you like them? Do you think they're terrible?
They're fine. I think what I've, my own sense of branding is don't name things for people anymore.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious.
Yeah.
I think that, because we're all flawed human beings.
Mhm.
And, there's some people we might very much admire, but, mores have a way of changing from time to time. And so I think when Audubon organizations drop the Audubon name, it's wise not to pick up somebody else's name.
Mhm.
I could see someone might want to start the Christian Cooper Society,
Mhm.
which I would happily join.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think a better approach is to emphasize,
Yeah.
I don't know, Nature Forward is probably not my pick, but they spent 6 months getting there.
Yeah.
So and I'm sure they met with branding consultants, and having been involved in a previous life with a branding exercise, I know how hard that is.
Mhm.
So, what organizations begin to call themselves in the future? Um, Again, if I were offering any advice, I'd say don't pick a person, pick an idea, pick an image, pick you know, some aspects you want to hold on to.
Yeah. Carl points out that Seattle was actually named after a person, but
Yes, I know.
we'll let that go. Yeah.
Well,
Uh, and Elaine has a comment here that I'm going to kind of paraphrase a little bit. And Elaine, forgive me if I don't get the gist of what you're saying here, correct? But do you feel that the like shame, for lack of a better word, or that's being painted on Audubon now, or that's come to light, does that reach all the way down into us having to or needing to reconsider his artistic work itself? Is the work less now? Is it less valuable? Is it less worthy of adoration because of the man that did it?
well, I think the question about value is a market question, and we'll see. We'll
Mhm.
see. Um, I, as I said, I think that there's no better avian artist in the 19th century, or perhaps even since then, than Audubon. He's very, very good. Just the reach and the depth of his work is remarkable. Um, and so I'm not taking down the Audubon painting I have in my dining room.
Mhm.
Um, I think that if I wanted to show somebody a very well done artistic image of a bird, and done, frankly, in an artistic fashion, I'd pick Audubon.
Okay.
But I would also, I think, have the asterisk, the follow up. Uh, he's a great artist, but like many great artists and many great people, there's some other aspects of his character that I don't find at all admirable. And I think we sometimes have to make distinctions as we look at people we admire, or people who've done admirable work, and say, here's the work, here's the person. And sometimes, one doesn't, the work doesn't justify the individual always, but also the flaws of the individual don't undermine the work itself. I mean, I think of all the novelists, the writers.
Yes.
You mentioned Mark Twain. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah.
Mark Twain's got some issues.
Yeah.
Faulkner's got some issues, and yet I assume they're going to continue to be studied. You opened with Shakespeare. We might have to take a look at him from time to time.
Mhm.
But I think there's always a distinction between the art and the artist, and they're not always the same.
Okay. Okay. Oh, Elaine has written back into the chat. I did put words in her mouth a bit incorrectly. And she says it was more of a point that the name can be changed, but the history can still remain. And yeah, that is certainly, I think everyone would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. I think we could come up with many more questions, and I know we are all very grateful that you took the time to share your scholarship and knowledge of this issue with us. And all I can say is well, thank you once again. Professor Nobles' book is available at Vroman's, available online, of course, too. And if you're at Vroman's, by the way, why not stop and pick up a copy of the Birding Guide to Pasadena, which is right there,
Sure.
right there as well. And if you find yourself birding over at the Huntington Library, why not take a couple of minutes and actually walk into the building there and see one of the most extraordinary works of art and printing that you will ever see.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes.
Yeah, it's worth. And listen, thank you very much. I'm sorry for the technical glitches in the beginning, but it's been a delight to be with you. I appreciate the questions. I might even go in the chat and see if I can read some more.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
And I think I would say that if anybody in the organization wants to write just directly to me, it's ghnobles@gmail. And feel free. I'll answer anybody's questions.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to throw that in the chat. And I'd like to remind everyone that Professor Nobles has kindly given us permission to record this talk and put it up on YouTube, and we should have it up in the next several days. And you're all welcome to share it far and wide. And with that, let's turn things back over to Pasadena Audubon President Luke Tiller. Luke.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk tonight. That was really interesting and informative, and I think the discussion was really, valuable too. So thank you so much for taking the time for that. We have had a couple of just comments in the chat, just kind of asking, what's happening as far as the leadership of Pasadena Audubon, and when will the organization be making a decision on the name. We're having a meeting next week of the board just to kind of talk about, basically the PAS kind of the board had decided we didn't want to get ahead of national on this, and we were waiting for their decision on what they were going to do. Following that, we basically wanted to start, as a conversation amongst the board, just to see where we're thinking of going with this. If people have, really strong opinions, or, we do have a kind of a general email, which is, I'll put it in the chat here. It's pasadenaaudubon@gmail.com. If you'd like to share your opinions, I can at least make those available at the meeting. So, yeah. Anything else we need to add for the thing, apart from to just say thank you to everyone for coming and asking insightful questions and joining us for the meeting. Look forward to seeing you in person next month.
Thank you.